Blessed day, my dear classmate, and welcome again to our new lesson today. For today, I'm going to discuss to you the chapter number 6, which is ecosystem. And again, this is connected to the previous discussions, and I even introduced you already what is all about ecosystem. However, we're going to look at more details and important informations regarding about ecosystem. Okay, so let me proceed on the next slide. Now, before we start, my dear classmate, let me just present to you a facts still related to our discussion. So, since we are talking about ecosystem, we were going to discuss also about animals or organisms. And if you don't know yet, there are some organisms nowadays that it is been rediscovered. So, it means that it is known that it is endangered or already extinct. Last 2019, we do have a rediscovered type of toad or frog, which is the known as the lost starry night or the starry night toad. And also in line to animals or organisms, my dear classmate, last 2019 also, California became the very first state to ban the sale of animal fur. And as we all know, when we talk about animal fur, it is being used to process or to come up with different products, such as a clothing products. Yeah, so more on coats and etc. Okay, so not only California but also other countries, and even here in the Philippines, we also banned the use of or the sale of animal fur. But then not all companies or not all industries. All right, so let us proceed now, my dear classmate. What are the things that we need to know in this chapter? So I'm going to present to you about ecosystem and the flow of energy, specifically food chain and then food web. I'm going to discuss also to you biogeochemical cycles. I'm not going to I'm not going to describe or present to you the different parts of that particular cycle, but we're going to look at the processes involved in that particular cycle, and we're going to present to you also the importance and impact of human activities in those particular biogeochemical cycles. And the last one, I'm going to present to you the interactions among organisms. What are the different ecological relationships of those different kinds of organisms? And that will be the last part. So let us start now with our basis. Now, as our foundation also, let us look at the definition of terms. So let's start with biosphere. So as we all know, when we talk about planet Earth, the layer of the Earth that supports life is what we call the biosphere. From the origin word itself, bio, which is life. So layer of the Earth that supports life, which is the biosphere. What else? Ecosystem. Again, ecosystem is defined as community or group of living organisms that live in and interact with each other in a specific environment. So that is again our ecosystem. And environment is defined as everything that affects an organism during its lifetime. And we have also niche, role or job of a species. And we also have habitat, that is the home or where organisms inhabit, and biotic factors, as well as we also have the abiotic factors. So biotic factors, as I have introduced you also this type of term in the previous chapter, that is the all forms of living organisms, and abiotic, that is the opposite now of biotic factors, which means they're all forms of non-living things that affect now our ecosystem. So now let us try to look at first this illustration, my dear classmate. This will summarize the concept of ecosystem. So we have said that the layer of the Earth that sustains life, or let's say forms life. So inside biosphere, we have what we call the ecosystem. And we have said before that ecosystem, there are two types now. We have what we call the land ecosystem and then the water ecosystem, or also known as the terrestrial and the aquatic ecosystem. And inside ecosystems, there is composed now this ecosystem. We have what we call the abiotic, then the non-living, or what we call the abiotic. Or the living organism is divided again into three categories. We have what we call the producers, the consumers, and we also have what we call the decomposers. When I talk about producers, those are basically the plants. And plants are considered to be autotrophs. Why autotrophs? Because they have the ability to manufacture their own food, or to produce their own food. We also have consumers. Consumers is basically pertaining only to animals, also known as heterotrophs. because they are actually depending on the autotrophs or on the producers. Decomposers is basically the microorganisms, and they are known as saprotrophs. Saprotrophs, aside from biotic or the living organisms, we also have the abiotic or the non-living things. Non-living things are also categorized into three. So we have their PIO, which means P is the physical factors, I is the inorganic, and then we also have O, which is the organic factors. Okay, so let's start with physical factors. Like for example, you have there the temperature, the humidity, the light, etc. For inorganic, we have there the water, the oxygen, the nitrogen, the carbon, and other kinds of inorganic factors. And we also have the organic factors, or let's say substances, no? So we have their proteins, carbohydrates, lipids. So those are the composition of the abiotic or the non-living things. Okay, so as we go on, we're going to look at the different important details regarding those different concepts or factors, and even the different terms that mentioned in this illustration. So let's start with the flow of energy, and specifically that is more on the food chain and food web. Okay, so let's start with food chain. Let us have a quick review. Now, I know that this was introduced to you already during your lower grade or lower year. So we have their food chain. Now, the food chain is actually a path, no? A path of energy from one living thing to another. And we have their decomposers, like bacteria, are necessary for all food chains. So decomposers are actually having a important role. Now, when we talk about this food chain or even the food web. Okay, so food chain, again, our keyword there is a path of energy. See, it's a transfer of energy from one living thing to another. Okay, so for example, you can see there, and we have there the producer as the plant, and we also have there a consumer, which is a herbivore, and then we also have another type of consumer, which is an omnivore, and we also have another consumer, which is a carnivore. Now, when we talk about food chain, my dear classmate, there are two different types. There are two different types of food chain. We have what we call the grazing food chain, and we also have what we call the detritus food chain. Now, when we talk about grazing food chain, this is more on the producers or the green plants depends upon sunlight, and producers are consumed by herbivores, animals, etc. They eat plants and they are consumed by carnivorous. So a simple illustration, you have there the plants as producer. We also have there the goat as a herbivore, or let's say a consumer, and we have another secondary consumer, which is the tiger, which is a carnivore or a carnivorous. Simply by looking at this illustration, we cannot find there the presence of decomposers. So meaning, when we talk about grazing food chain, it only composes the producers and the consumers. Okay, so we don't have what we call decomposers. Now, if we include now decomposers in that particular type of food chain, that's the time that we can call this one as detritus food chain. Okay, why detritus food chain? Type of food chain initiated by microorganisms like bacteria and fungi, or basically that is the presence of decomposers. Okay, so you have there, for example, dead bodies of animals, and then we have there flies, and then we also have frog, snake, and then hawk. Okay, so important note that you need to remember, my dear classmate. Interdependency within a food chain helps to maintain the balance of plant and animal population, either detritus food chain or a grazing food chain. Now that we know the two types of food chain, or we know about food chain, the question is, what is the importance? So let's say, what is the function? Now, what is the significance of food chain in our ecosystem or within our planet Earth? Okay, so first thing there, it represents the life of community. Probably, now because there are various types of organisms when we talk about that food chain. And what else? It helps in the transfer of energy from one level to another. And it shows energy flow mechanism, or not only in a single food chain, but in a different types of food chain. And when you talk about the food web, that is actually a rapid food chain. So it means it is only it is not only showing a single line of food chain, but it also shows a food web. So it also shows yung ating energy flow of mechanism. So how is the transfer from one organism to the other? And mind you also, when you talk about food chain, only 10%, 10% is being transferred from one organism to the next organism. So sometimes we call also the transfer of energy for food chain as the 10% energy transfer. Kasi nga 10% lang yung napapasa or being transferred to the next organism. And lastly, the food chain helps in the feeding relationship and interaction between organization or between that particular community of organisms. So isn't it that every organisms are depending? Let's say when you talk about the concept, the concept of survival of the fittest. So as an example, you can see there, and we have there the first consumer, or let's say this is the producer. And then, consumer, since that is an animal, still a fish, So first consumer or primary, we have the secondary consumer, and we also have the tertiary consumer. So we are depending, or each organisms are depending to each other. There will be a problem within our ecosystem or within the environment. Probably the food chain and the food web will be distracted. So here are some examples again of food chain, and then we also have an example of the food web. So look at the difference. So this is a example of a food chain. So you have the grass, the grasshopper, the frog, and we also have again another example. And this is what it looks like when you talk about food web. Again, when you talk about food web, that is only the rapid food chain. So they have actually a similar function within our ecosystem or within a particular community. So that is all about the flow of energy. Again, that is only a quick review on when you talk about food chain or the flow of energy within our ecosystem. Now, this is one of the main point of our lesson today, which is the biogeochemical cycle. So I asked you before on last chapter to read in advance, and I do hope that you read in advance about biogeochemical cycles. So biogeochemical cycle, it is a cycling of nutrients. Let's say for example, we have the water, carbon, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, etc. from abiotic components of the ecosystem, which is the water, air, soil, and then rock, through the biotic components. Like for example, we have there the plants, animals, fungi, and bacteria. So basically, when you talk about this biogeochemical cycle, it is also a pathway. A pathway by which chemical element or molecules moves. It also serve as an interactions exists in the four spheres. So four spheres, why four spheres? If you still remember the four sphere of our planet Earth, we have there the atmosphere, the biosphere, the geosphere, and the hydrosphere. So there are interactions of those four existing spheres within our planet. That is why if you try to look at the term, we have there the biogeochemical. So bio means life, geo means earth, chemical, it pertains to the different elements, or let's say the different nutrients or maybe different chemicals. So there are interaction of the four existing spheres within our planet Earth. The simple illustration of biogeochemical cycle or how it works. So the elements are actually flowing in the different organisms, and then it will be used by the different organisms, and then so elements travel among air, land, and sea through physical processes. So we have there the different elements that is flowing, or let's say traveling within our environment, and that is why biogeochemical cycle is one of the important type of cycles that we need to take note when you talk about ecosystem. And most of the time, these are being violated, or there is a lot of destruction because of human activities. And not only human activities, but as well as natural events or natural phenomena. First type of biogeochemical cycle, which is the carbon cycle. So that is a simplified diagram of the carbon cycle. Now, I have said to you, my dear classmate, we are not going to look at the process itself or the cycle itself. But I'm going to introduce to you only the different processes involved with this cycle, and then the importance of this cycle. So you can see there, when you try to look at the different processes involved, you have their evaporation. We also have a process of transpiration. What else that you can see there? We have also respiration, as one of the processes involved within our carbon cycle. Okay, so what is now the importance of this type of carbon cycle when you talk about this or when we try to look at the significance or importance within ecosystem? So first thing, it is actually a key element, a key element of life, composing now almost half of the dry mass of the Earth's plants. So if you try to remove all water within our planet, and what remains is actually the mass of the dry mass, or let's say that composed of a carbon. Okay? And it is also essential or very useful, or it is needed for photosynthesis and respiration. So again, I have mentioned respiration. So the breathing and the breathing processes of a particular organism, and even for humans, and photosynthesis that is very useful for for processing now the food. And decomposition serves as the Earth's waste disposal system when you talk about this carbon cycle, or when you talk about carbon. Okay, so it serves as actually the Earth's waste disposal system. And it affects also the climate change. So we have mentioned also before that if there will be too much carbon, let's say carbon dioxide within our atmosphere, probably it will contribute now to what we call climate change. Okay? Or there will be an effect within our climate change. Alright, and it is also linked to other cycles. So later on, we're going to see those link other cycles with carbon cycle. The next one is we have the oxygen cycle. And we have mentioned a while back, when we talk about carbon cycle, it is linked to other cycles. And one of the type of cycle that is linked to carbon cycle is we have the oxygen cycle. So if you can see on the simple diagram of oxygen cycle, you can see there a carbon dioxide. And we also have their combustion. So it means that still, that is carbon dioxide is also present to carbon cycle. So they are actually linked together. Okay, so what are the importance of this oxygen cycle? So it is actually composed of 22% oxygen within our atmosphere, and it is used by humans and animals through two different processes. Again, we have their photosynthesis and respiration. So similar to carbon cycle. So they have also photosynthesis, or also used for photosynthesis and respiration. What else? It supports combustion. So if you still remember your history of science about chemistry, we will start a fire. We need a reaction of the oxygen. So if you look at the simple illustration again, or diagram of the oxygen cycle, we have there the oxygen that is coming from the atmosphere, and this will be used for the breathing, or let's say respiration process from plants and then animals and even humans. Respiration also from decomposers, and the animals and then plants are also releasing now carbon dioxide and even taking in carbon dioxide. And we also have again the photosynthesis by green plants, and it will go back to our atmosphere. So again, just take note on the involved processes and then the importance of this oxygen cycle. Aside from oxygen cycle, we also have the water cycle. So the water cycle, if you can see the simple diagram, you can see there are different sources of water. So from the groundwater, from the ocean, we also have the we also have the runoff, and we have what you call the streams or rivers, and we also have water coming from the precipitation, and even from the perspiration perspiration of the different organisms, and even yung secretion or let's say yung urination of the organisms. That is also another source of water when you talk about water cycle. Now, if you can see if you again observe the processes involved in this particular diagram of water cycle, you can see there again the transpiration, and we also have evaporation, precipitation, condensation. So what now is the importance now of water? We know that water is actually one of the important let's say a compound that sustains now life now within our planet Earth. And our Earth is composed of 75% of water. Okay, so around 25% is land. Okay, another one, water recycles over and over. A renewable type source. Again, I have mentioned to you, it sustains life. What else? It makes up 60 to 70% of human body is actually water. Okay, so take note on that one. That's why water is very important. And we know that we're going to feel different way, or we will get sick if we don't have enough water in our body. Yan, we have what we call we are being dehydrated. That's why water again is very important. Now, a drinkable water is very important for the survival. Okay? And that's it, my dear classmate, when we talk about water cycle. So again, take note on the processes involved, and we also have the importances of the water cycle. And now, let's talk about the next cycle, which is the sulfur cycle. And sulfur cycle, if you try to look at the diagram again, my dear classmate, it is more on it's actually the sulfur. Let's say the sulfur itself, or let's say the sulfates, is being released in the atmosphere from again from a natural phenomenon. No? So let's say, for example, from the smoke coming from a volcano, etc. And probably when you talk about sulfur or sulfates, there is an impact. No? There's an impact within our ecosystem. And take note that when you talk about the human activities, when you try to look at the diagram, you have their industries. No, industries are also contributing to the release or producing of the sulfur. Say the sulfur oxide, or let's say the sulfate. And we know that if there will be too much sulfur, and it will also lead to a bad effect, or negative effect, or negative impact within our environment. But then it is still essential. Now, there's an importance or significance of this cycle. Why? Because one of the components that makes up the proteins and vitamins are actually sulfur, or let's say sulfate. No? So that is why it is still a very important type of a cycle. And it can be dissolved in water that can consume by plants and animals. Take note now, if you try to look at this illustration, yan. So from the atmosphere, it will be dissolved in the water, and the water will, or in that water, organisms, or let's say marine organisms, we're going to use also this sulfate or sulfur, because again, it will one of the components of protein and vitamins. Okay? And many animals, including humans, depends on plants for sulfur containing amino acid. I take note, amino acid is very important in our body. So it is one of also of the things that we need, and that is why not only humans but also other organisms. Yan, so napaka-importante or very important when you talk about sulfur cycle is again important. Or let's say sulfur, or the presence of sulfur is very important when you talk about this, when you talk about amino acid. Another one is that it is stored underground from rocks and then minerals, so it can be mined. And so if we need sulfur, and we are actually mining those types of rocks and minerals that have this kind of an element, which is the sulfur oxide, or say the sulfate itself. The consequence, now, if there will be too much sulfur, or let's say sulfate in the atmosphere, it will also lead now, or will result now to what we call air pollution, and also acid rain. Yan. So that is one of the reasons why we also experience acid rain, because of the too much content of sulfur within our atmosphere. Although there is an important role also of the sulfur. What are processes involved? Again, we have their precipitation, so acid precipitation. We also have mining as part of the included or involved processes when you talk about sulfur cycle. So we have the last type of cycle, which is the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus cycle, or when you talk about phosphorus, this is also having a very good role or impact, or there is importance now within our ecosystem, and even to us human being, and even the other living organisms. So if you try to look at the phosphorus cycle, and you can see there how is the process now of the phosphorus cycle. So from the different sources of phosphorus. Phosphorus in the animal kingdom, so this is now the importance now of the phosphorus cycle, or let's say the phosphorus itself. So phosphorus, it is actually required in every cell in the human body. So you see, we are actually depending also on the phosphorus, or let's say it came up to be in the form of phosphate. Yan, phosphate actually yung kanyang form when you talk about already in the inside of our body. Yan. So most phosphorus is in the form of phosphate, or that is PO4, and 85% of the phosphorus in the body is in bone, yan, in the form of calcium phosphate. So what makes our bone stronger is actually the presence of the calcium phosphate, and again, that is a type or a form of a phosphorus. Okay, and cell membranes have the phospholipid bilayer. DNA and RNA have phosphate as one of the three components of the nucleotide. Okay, so again, it is very essential when you talk about DNA and then RNA, because again, we are going to talk already with the genetic characteristics, no, and it strengthen and even maintain or sustain now the health of our genes, no. And when we talk about DNA and RNA, even the different structure or the structure of the DNA and RNA, even the function, no, the normal function of the DNA and RNA, because of this phosphate. There are types of phosphorus. There is what we call a red phosphorus, a white phosphorus. White phosphorus are actually used for explosions, no. So like for example, dynamites, those are a type of phosphorus that they are using. And then we also have the red phosphorus. Red phosphorus is a very good example is that the head, no, the head of the match, yung matchsticks. So that is actually an example of a phosphorus. So that is a red phosphorus. Okay? And we also have another type of used for processing now or producing now a fertilizer. Yan. So if you observe nowadays, we have actually a lot of fertilizers that contains phosphate. Okay, so again, take note that is very essential, no, or very important when you talk about DNA and RNA. Biogeochemical cycles are actually very important. So now the problem in reality, although we have these kinds of biogeochemical cycles that maintain or sustain also the flow within our environment, or let's say our ecosystem, however, because of the human activities, no, there are impacts or will result now to a different distractions, no, or problems. Let's say for example, you have their environmental degradation, and one example is what we call deforestation, the industrial progression, what else, because of the use of too much plastics and different kinds of other kinds of human activities that will lead now to deforestation. What else? Environmental problems, like for example, again, we have their pollution, and because of industries, because of the chemicals that we have been using in other kinds of human activities. Global climate change also will being affected, and contamination of they say the different sources, no, water and even the air, no, will be contaminated because of these industries and different causes now or reasons to have or will cause now or will lead now to contamination, and altering now the natural flow, okay, the natural flow of our ecosystem. Why? Take note now, my dear classmate, when we talk about biogeochemical cycles, since this was being used also by us and even the living organisms, if there will be because of experiments, no, human experiments or laboratory experiments, it's also altering now yung ating natural flow of the ecosystem. That is the one problem that we are facing during this time, especially that we have now advanced science and technologies, and the loss of biodiversity. No, so the death of animals, the extinction of animals, or there will be an endangered species because of human activities and because of hunting or because of the use of chemicals, because of burning of forests, etc. The loss of biodiversity, the loss of the habitat or the home of the different organisms, that will also cause or will have an impact within biogeochemical cycles. Okay? So it will also distract or will also have an impact on the natural flow of the biogeochemical cycles. It is really nice to see that there's a lot of programs and even policies or laws to protect our environment. Like for example, we have mentioned on chapter number 4, the environmental protection laws. And we also have different concepts, no, that we are applying, especially when we talk about sustainable development or that concept itself of sustainability. Okay? And that is how we can save also, or we can maintain the natural flow of the biogeochemical cycle. So in reality, my dear classmate, at present, no, or currently, what is happening within our ecosystem is already being distracted because of those things that we are also doing as humans. Okay? So again, we are primarily responsible enough to see what is happening within our ecosystem. Aside from the biogeochemical cycle, we need to look at also the interactions of organisms, and specifically that is the ecological relationship of organisms. So let's start with the first one, which is what we call predation. So predation is defined as organisms eats another organism, or in a broader definition, we can say that it is a biological interaction. Now, where one organism there is a predator and it kills and eats another organism, and that is what we call the prey. Okay, so we have now the presence of predator and its prey. Okay, so an example, and you can see there in the right screen of our PowerPoint, no, the bear is eating a fish, and that is a very good example when we talk about predation. So aside from predation, we also have what we call competition. Now, competition is basically it is a competition, or let's say a compete, no, for the same resources. So let's say, for example, aside from this bear that is aiming for the fish, there are also a kind of animal. Let's say, for example, there is a platypus, no, that will also aim with this type of fish, or maybe a type of bird that we're going to aim for this fish. Okay, so they are competing now for the same resources in a given time or in a given place. Okay, so that is what we call competition. Aside from competition, we also have different types of competition. No, so not only a competition itself, but it is actually having a different types of competition. So we have their consumptive or exploitative. So it means that they are competing with the same resources. Yan ang tinatawag natin na consumptive or exploitative. So another type, we have what we call interference. So they are competing with the different, they are competing in the territories. Okay, so for example, no, the bear, again, let's try to look at the bear. So the bear in the, let's say, the bear in and a lion is competing in that territory. Because of that, maybe because of the resources that they can find in that particular territory, etc. That is what we call interference. And we also have what we call the preemptive competition. So how is this one? So if interference is more on territories, or they are competing in territories, for preemptive competition, it is also more on territory. However, there is a difference, a quite difference of that two. You can see there that I put there new territory. So let's say, for example, let's say two animals, no, let's say a bear and lion, we're going to transfer to a new territory, and they're going to compete actually with each other. That is what we call preemptive, no, preemptive competition. Okay? Unlike when you talk about interference, when you talk about interference, they have their own territories. But once you go there, let's say that territory of the bear, and then a lion will go there to interfere. That is what we call the interference competition. Okay? While when you talk about preemptive, preemptive from the word emptive, from the word or from the origin word empty. Now let's say that particular territory is not being occupied by an animal. So it means that two animals were going to occupy that territory. However, they have both of them are new. No, new to that particular, or they are the first one, or the two animals that were going to occupy that territory. However, they need to compete. That is what we call preemptive competition. Okay, so that is why I put there new territory. But for interference competition, there is already a owner of the territory, but another animal or organism are going to compete on that particular, or let's say interfere, no, in that particular territory. Okay, so that is what we call interference competition. And aside from competition, we also have what we call commensalism. Okay, commensalism, one benefits, the other do not. It is a relationship, no, between two species. Wherein, again, one benefits and then the other is actually do not benefit. And what are some examples? A very good example is when you talk about the cow. Now, let's say a carabao. A bird is standing at the back of the cow, and the bird is actually benefiting now on that cow, because he can the bird can eat now the insect within the back of that cow, or maybe it will serve as his as the bird's guardian, no, so he can avoid, or the bird can avoid distraction from a predator, etc. And that is what we call commensalism. Aside from commensalism, we also have what we call mutualism. Mutualism, both have benefits, no? So meaning they are benefiting to each other. So let's say, for example, again, let's go back on the idea of what we call the idea of a bird, and then let's say a bird, and then a cow, no? So the cow is benefiting to the bird because it kills. Now let's say for example the bird is killing the destructive insect within the back of the cow, and then at the same time the bird is also benefiting to that insect or to that cow. Okay, so there is what we call mutualism. Okay, and then later on I'm going to give you another example. And we also have what we call the parasitism. When we talk about this term, a symbolic relationship, no, between species where one organism, or let's say one organism benefits the other and the other is actually being harmed. So when we talk about parasitism, it is a little bit opposite, no, to the term or to the concept of commensalism. Kasi nga, commensalism, one benefits to the other but the other one is do not. However, the difference is that when you talk about parasitism, the other one is actually being harmed. Yan, being harmed, no? So there is a negative impact within that particular organism. So the one is benefiting, the other one is also being harmed. So that is what we call parasitism. So from the word itself, parasite, no? We are actually talking about parasites here. So let's say for example, a worm. You say a worm that is staying or living inside the stomach of the pig. And isn't it that that parasite or that worm is benefiting in the whatever the food that is that can be eaten by the pig, but the pig is actually being harmed. And because as we all know, and it will result now to a different or there will be a problem, no, to that pig if there will be a worm that is staying within the inside the body of or inside the stomach of the pig. Okay, so that is what we call parasitism. Another one, when we talk about this parasitism, there is another form, no, of parasitism. We have what we call the parasitoidism. And when we talk about this form of parasitism, organisms, no, called or also known as parasitoid, yan kaya tinawag na parasitoidism, lives or inside the host at one phase in its life cycle. And the worst thing that will happen when you talk about parasitoidism, the host is actually being killed. Okay, so it ends up in the death of the host of that particular parasite, no, yung tinatawag natin na parasitoid. Okay, so let's say for example, no, let's say a parasite, or let's say a very destructive type of parasite that will live inside a human's body, and definitely this parasite will going to kill now the human cells, and it will turn out or will end up that the human will going to die. That is what we call parasitoidism. Okay, so different. It is very different to parasitism. Okay, so parasitism is only being harmed, but parasitoidism, the host is actually being killed. That is actually our keyword. No, the host is being killed. Okay, or host is killed by this type of parasite. Okay, so again, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different ecological relationships. We have what we call predation, we have competition, commensalism, mutualism, and then parasitism. All those ecological relationship has an impact also within our ecosystem, and it also one of the natural processes, no, that is, or let's say natural concept that is happening within an ecosystem. Yan yung tinatawag natin na ecological relationship. Okay? And my dear classmate, here are the different examples, no? So as I present the example, I want you to answer there in the comment section or the chat section, just for us to recheck your understanding towards the ecological relationship. So let's start with the first one. Yan, owls that eat mice and lions that eat gazelle. What is your answer there? That is an example of a predation. Okay, very good. That is an example of predation. Next one, lions and hyenas that compete for prey. That is definitely a competition. And whale gains no benefit from one barnacle, but the barnacles gain mobility. So one is benefiting, the other one is not. That is what we call commensalism. Okay, very good. And we also have worms inside the stomach of a pig. We have mentioned already a while back. That is what we call parasitism. And we also have the bees and flowers. Yeah, so bees are benefiting to to the flower, and then the flower is also benefiting to bees, because the bees are transferring the pollen not from one other to the other place. So both are benefiting to each other. That is what we call mutualism. Okay, very good. So that is mutualism. And those are the different examples when we talk about the ecological relationship. So hoping that you will take note now on those different ecological relationships from predation until parasitism. And that's it, my dear classmate. Again, the importance of this topic upon knowing those different terms or concepts from biogeochemical cycles, or let's say from the flow of energy to biogeochemical cycles, and then we also have the ecological relationships. So by that thing, we're going to understand now what is inside ecosystem, and we know that if something will happen to our ecosystem, it will result now to a different environmental problems, like we have mentioned a while back, and deforestation, pollution, global climate change, etc. Okay, so this is actually a very good additional knowledge or additional information to everybody. And I hope that for the coming years, we continue to take care of our environment. We could continue to take care of our ecosystem. And hoping that you learned something with this lesson or this discussion. Thank you so much, my dear classmate, for joining me this chapter 6 discussion. And if you do have questions or clarifications, just post it in our canvas or in our group chat. Enjoy the rest of the day and take care always, and then God bless everyone. See you in the next chapter.